Okay, and so we're talking this week about language and literacy and for early learners. So again, we're talking of toddlers, infants, and preschoolers. And by three, most children have a receptive vocabulary of thousands of words. And remember that their receptive vocabulary always outpaces or is greater than their expressive vocabulary. What I mean is that children understand the meanings of more words than they will speak. They're Our preschoolers are growing in their knowledge of grammatical structures within the languages that they speak, different functions or purposes or uses of language. Uh, and so there's language development both in the spoken or oral language and in what's called emergent literacy skills. So their development of reading and writing skills, those skills we're laying the foundations, and that's what's called emergent literacy. We're laying the foundations in the early years for those literacy skills. And so we'll talk about both of those in turn. In oral language development, we have both receptive and expressive vocabulary. So children are learning the meaning of words. They're learning things like words can have more than one meaning. They're learning the appropriate use of language in given circumstances. They're also becoming aware of the basic units of sound, which are called phonemes. And they're beginning to come up with the idea that those scribbly things that are on paper or computer screens are symbols that represent not just letters, but sounds. And if you think about it, think about English, for example, a letter isn't synonymous with a phoneme. So a phoneme is the basic unit of sound in any given language, but we have more than one sound for many letters. We have a C can make a sound like in Cindy or a K sound like in cat, but a K sound can also be with a K like kangaroo. So a phoneme can be represented by more than one letter, and sometimes phonemes are multiple combinations of letters, like CH makes a ch sound, or PH, like in pharmacy, makes a f sound, which is also made by an F. So we kind of made our language a little bit confusing in terms of coming up with phonological awareness. Uh, but this is one of the most important skills for being able to decode and read and write in ways that other people can understand. So young children can have difficulty with a variety of different areas in language development. There can be a given child may have difficulty with vocabulary growth. They may have uh, a vocabulary where the extent of the vocabulary lags behind other children of their same age. They can have physical problems with the correct pronunciation of a given phoneme or a given sound in the language. Uh, an easy example of this is the words mother or father or feather. It's very common for 2 and 3-year-olds to say things like mother or father or feather. Um, to a large degree, by the time they transition to elementary school, many of those pronunciation difficulties, they will simply have matured past with experience. But there are many children who aren't going to just mature past that and who benefit from directive, intentional uh, speech therapy and practice and work. Another thing that children can have difficulty with is learning their numbers and letters, those symbols themselves, uh, and understanding and making rhymes. They may have difficulty finding the right word or difficulties with peer interaction and knowing the language that initiates and continues interacting with peers. They may not uh, be very skilled at following directions, so they may have difficulty there in decoding the language that is being spoken to them. And so some children who are typically hearing, they have the the physical aspects for hearing, the sounds when that sensation of the sound reaches their brain for interpretation, they may have difficulty interpreting what that sound means. It could sound kind of like static, or it could sound their brain might misinterpret a word for one or another. And this is where we have auditory processing and language processing disorders. So phonological awareness is one of those really important pre-literacy skills. Uh, Breaking down words into the syllables helps children develop phonological awareness, breaking that word down and saying it. Phonological awareness, breaking it down into the syllables that make those sounds. Rhyming words, words with the same ending or beginning, and blending sounds into words, segmenting words into sounds, moving sounds to make new words. All of those are aspects of phonological awareness. Emergent literacy development overall includes not only phonemic awareness, those elements of sounds, but also alphabetic awareness, which is being able to recognize those alphabetic symbols, and concepts of print. This is the development of all those basic rules within a given language about how print works. So in English, we read from left to right. We hold a book this way. We turn pages that way. We we read one line at a time. We know that those spaces between the words segment them. All of those are aspects of the the function of the written word that children have to be able to acquire. Uh, Reading conventions and writing conventions, those are the same kinds of things. These are the ways that we have agreed upon to read and write. So those rules that function to help us understand that. So when children are beginning to pick up those writing instruments, we can support that by allowing them to use temporary or inventive spelling. They're spelling out words based upon the phonemic sounds that they have become aware of. So I, I used the word pharmacy a minute ago for the PH sound, which is a terrible example, but a young child might write Pharmaci. It's for pharmacy. They're writing it the way it sounds based upon the phonemes that they know and understand. It's not important in the preschool years to really focus on that correct spelling. We're grateful and glad and proud and encouraging that they are taking those phonemes that they know, and they are using those to put together, to communicate, to create the process of developing that written language. We support them by using paper that doesn't have lines, because their writing can go up and down and back and forward, and uh, we appreciate that it's very common for 4-year-olds to write going up or going down or backwards. As long as the writing comes drawing, and remember that for young children, drawing is a process, that they're often not thinking about the outcome as a model. Here's what this picture is going to be. So think about drawing those ideas, drawing the process as a way of communicating as they're writing. Ask children to dictate their writing to you, and for writing that adults may not understand. For example, when a 2-year-old is just making scribble marks, it can be helpful for the adult to write that dictated uh, story on the back of the paper so that we can read it back to the child later. What we're doing is we're demonstrating to them that writing has a purpose, that it's used to convey information from one person to another, that it's a meaningful task. And that's really an important part of emergent writing. It supports writing to have words that are often used displayed appropriately around the room. So we use writing to label things in the classroom. We use writing to give sort of templates or models of some of those frequently used words. All right, this slide is showing some of the sources and purposes of curricular goals. In terms of writing and reading language standards, you have the standards from the 10 ELDs in your reading, in your text. There are also standards uh, from the International Reading Association, the National Council of Teaching English. The purpose of goals here are to help children, to encourage them to communicate their ideas and feelings and to interpret what messages they receive. And so our goals as early childhood educators is to think about what is the appropriate goal here for developing speaking skills, listening, reading, and writing skills. What goals are appropriate for this child uh, as we're thinking about working towards those long-term standards. And I've got oddball things here, sorry. So there's a lot of words on these next couple of slides, but these are some specific teaching strategies for the early childhood classroom. Number one is what's called a communication-rich environment or a language-rich environment or a verbally rich environment. We're making the classroom a place where there is verbal spoken language as well as a print-rich environment where there's written examples. So I gave that example a minute ago of using labels for things in the classroom or labels where things go. This is the block area. This shelf has Tinker Toys, and so there's a label that's taped there and lives there. Here's where the scissors go. So the word scissors is there. So a communication-rich environment is the equivalent in our spoken language that we're using things like reflections, we're using things like conversation extenders. We're creating an environment where children are surrounded by language. We're the adults are models for listening and observing. They are opportunities every day where children are engaged in writing, daily reading activities where we're reading with children, uh, where children are actively engaged. And so the reading materials are actually interesting information in books. They're books with uh, characters who do interesting things. They're not just uh, designed to drill the phonemic awareness. They're engaging and interesting, tied to what's going on in the classroom, such as a theme. It's also important that the adults show, and I mentioned this a moment ago, that reading and writing has purposes. We write notes to each other. We put signs up. We use communication in ways that demonstrate to children that there's a purpose behind writing and reading. We explore our books in different ways. So at group time, we may act out the story or do a flannel board of the story. We encourage children as we're reading the story to make predictions about what's going to happen next. We talk about the characters and what the character might be thinking and ask them why the character is doing this. And we talk about the parts of the story having a beginning and a middle and an end. And especially with our young children, we allow and encourage them to read us the books, even if they're not sounding it out. Maybe they're reading it from memory or reading it based upon the pictures. Those are important steps along the way to developing reading skills. Oh, so we have books and writing materials in the dramatic play area, in the block area. Uh, we're talking about academic literacy terminology, using things like letter and word just as a natural part of our language. Uh, our classroom routines and limits are written, so our pictogram has both words and pictures of showing what our schedule for the day is or our classroom routines for the day. And we read those things in the environment out loud and we comment on them. We are a model. We take the time to purposely, intentionally model when we're reading that we're going from the left to the right. We might use our fingers or we might even discuss or point out to the child that that's what we're doing. If there are new words, we might write them down or put them on a word wall or some kind of board, and maybe we'll talk about what that word means. Playing sound games and silly songs and poems and playing with sounds and rhyming words and all of those things are important parts of making language learning fun because language learning should be fun. It shouldn't feel like a drill time and uh, really, what's the word I'm looking for? It shouldn't feel like kids are being quizzed or that they're being drilled over and over repetitively. It should be fun and natural. Children's printed names are important to use for labels, so they're recognizing their names. It's typical, not always, but it's typical that the first word letters that children recognize and then write are the first letter in their first name, and then the first letter in their last name, then the second letter in their first name. So recognize there's that typical kind of trend there, but give them opportunities to see and write their names and use them as labels. For example, putting it on their art project. I get all those. Ah, so we should have access to alphabet letters. So it's very common in early childhood classrooms to see letters posted on the wall and so on. But you can also have tracing letters in the writing area or puzzle letters with wooden block shapes. So different kinds of context for letters in the alphabet. Think about the first letter and sounds in alphabet books and posters, but also think about those places that children naturally they're doing some reading that they don't realize yet and that other adults don't realize yet. Think about logos like the M for McDonald's. A whole bunch of young children know what that McDonald's sign means. Not all of them, of course, but think about those kind of logos and things that they come into contact with for those everyday kinds of opportunities to look at uh, those letters. There should be an interest area that has materials with print, textbooks, nonfiction books. Uh, all of these should be in the classroom. Um, and stories should be fun and animated. It says use your voice and expression. Not too long, not too short. It's important to reread those stories over time, both in the whole group and individually, to find new words in the story as you go and discuss that story after you read it. And remember that I mentioned language processing and auditory processing disorder a moment ago, but there's going to be some particular needs of different learners in our classroom. We may have children with the hearing loss, and so we're going to have to think of some particular strategies. And those strategies aren't a one size fits all kind of situation because just to take that one example of children with hearing loss, there's a whole range of children there who can capitalize on different amounts of residual hearing, for example. But some of the same strategies that work for hearing loss could also work for children with learning disabilities and English language learners. For example, this is a weird thing, it's what I have in my hand. These are glasses. When I say this, I'm pointing to it and I'm putting it right next to my mouth here so that you can see my face and the thing at the same time that I'm talking about the glasses. And so I say it a couple of times, and I'm making this very concrete. And that, my friends, is what I really wanted to share today.